Hello and welcome to this week's Business Tomorrow, the show here on CNBC Africa dedicated to reopening business after COVID-19. I'm Chris Bishop. Now this week we look at one of the often forgotten casualties of COVID-19, and it has been the media. Sure, we've all been broadcasting all these months and publishing during the lockdown at a time when information has been more vital than ever. But underneath, the media in Africa has been bleeding. Jobs have gone, contracts cancelled, pay cuts, and the future even appears even more uncertain. Let's have a quick look at the background. The media faces an uphill battle for survival at a time of one of the greatest upheavals and disruptions since Caxton came up with the printing press. For years, the traditional media in Africa has seen its power wane in the face of technological changes and shrinking advertising. Newsrooms have been weakened by juniorization as experienced journalists leave for better paid jobs in government and PR. Even before COVID-19, the industry was in poor shape. In South Africa alone, the number of jobs in journalism has halved in the last few years, according to SANEF, and COVID-19 is likely to make it far worse. SANEF says half of its members have lost more than 70% of their income as pay cuts and a freeze on freelance payments take their toll. In South Africa alone, in the last 10 years, there's been a 49% drop in circulation for newspapers. In Kenya, in 2018, the number of English daily newspapers sold declined to 87.1 million from 102 million in 2014. The number of Kiswahili daily newspapers declined to 37 million copies in 2018 from 58 million just 4 years before. On top of this, the industry is still plagued by vague regulation, enduring monopolies, and declining investment. And remember, this is the first of a two-part discussion on the media. Next week, on June the 15th, on the eve of Youth Day in South Africa, we'll be taking a look at social media, online, and the opportunities in the media for young entrepreneurs. But first, our online panel today. Joining me now on Zoom, Paula Fray, founder and CEO at Fray Intermedia, Andy Gill, managing editor at Arena Holdings that publishes the Sunday Times and Financial Mail, and Takutua Hove, the chief operating officer at Independent Media. So just to start off with, all round, if I could go through, I mean, how deep has been the damage caused by this COVID-19, bearing in mind the economy wasn't in great shape to start with? Starting off with you, Andy Gill at Arena.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, you're quite right. We didn't go into the COVID crisis in magnificent shape, given the economic turmoil that we've had in South Africa already. But I must say, if I look at our numbers for April and the performance for April, I've been in this business for 20 years. It's never been as bad as that. April was a shocker. There has been significant improvement, I must say, since then. When I say significant, we're not near pre-COVID levels, but it's been very hard.
And if I could come to you, Takutua Hove, over at The Independent, another huge publishing organization. Already you were fighting for your space in the media before COVID-19. How hard have you been hit?
Yes, I share Andrew's sentiments. We've also experienced like similar challenges. Media has always been in this pretty schizophrenic space where, with all the challenges imposed on us with digital platforms, and also an economy in South Africa which has experienced negative real GDP growth over the last couple of years, our revenue has always been under pressure. Interestingly enough, at the beginning of the year, it was actually looking as if the tide was slightly turning, but then almost overnight, this pandemic hit the South African shores and everything came collapsing almost overnight.
And Paula Fray, if I just talk to you as well, you've had a very long history in the media as a journalist and an editor. But now you're in a slightly different space now. You're a filmmaker as well in this continent. How hard has it hit your side of the business?
So Chris, we do a lot of work training across the continent, training journalists across the continent, and in the first few days of the pandemic, I mean, it was devastating. We've seen lots and lots of shutdowns. We've seen journalists being retrenched. We've seen cuts in salaries. We've seen people being put onto forced leave. And generally, the situation has been quite difficult. With a lot of the smaller organizations that we work with, we're finding that they've slowly been able to come back, but it's been a difficult time just all round.
And if I come back to you, Andy, as well, I mean, a lot of people are talking about it at the moment. I mean, how many of the media organizations and newspapers and stations that we know could go to the wall, you think, in the next year, bearing in mind how bad things have been?
So if you'd asked me this at the end of April, I would have said quite a lot of them. It really was looking absolutely poor. I mean, I think we saw a couple of the magazine publishers announce their closures, and that was coming from a very fragile place already, as you know. So while I think there will be casualties, there's no question. Those who came in with fragile business models will struggle to emerge in a very sustainable manner. They're going to have to make fundamental change to their organizational structure, and also businesses which have sort of single source type product sets. We're lucky enough to be very diversified in terms of having newspapers, a big digital play, TV, radio. We even have a films business and a music business. And because of that, we were able to at least weather storms a little stronger. It's those with a sort of single product base and a relatively large operating cost base, fixed cost base, that are going to struggle.
And for those that are going to survive, I mean, the independent media, Takutu, has been around for more than a century. How lean are their production, development and research budgets likely to be? I mean, you must be certainly cutting back a lot at the future right now.
Yes, we've had to cut back quite a lot of that type of expenditure. But that said, at the end of the day, there's still a minimum cost structure that the business still needs to survive with. So that said, the key focus is obviously going to be focusing on those key revenue lines that we believe are going to be sustainable. It is true, as cited by quite a few media companies that have shut down, that some of the revenue that was out there in the market has disappeared, and it's just disappeared indefinitely. So it requires us to start streamlining our business going forward. And we definitely have to rethink our entire way of doing business. It can never be business as usual. The way people individually and businesses interact with each other has now changed fundamentally. And if we're not dynamic and agile enough during the next couple of months, quite a few media houses are definitely not going to survive until beyond the end of this year.
Certainly. So, Paula, you were saying that these cutback in budgets, etc., of the big media houses in Africa, it must have been a big setback to your business with training. There's an old expression amongst us older journalists that if journalists can't tell us what's happening, who can? How much of a setback do you think this time is for free speech and the building of an independent media?
So across the continent, we've had several reports of journalists. So journalists are essentially regarded as essential workers, which means that they could work during the lockdown at the start of the pandemic. And we've had lots of reports across the continent of journalists actually being attacked or being arrested. And so there are lots of issues, but particularly the issue of free speech relates to the issue of so-called fake news. And what we've had is a number of governments have put in laws around the dissemination of disinformation. So just to make the distinction very quickly, misinformation is the inadvertent passing on of news that isn't true, whereas disinformation is the deliberate spreading of news that is wrong, that is false. And so there's some concerns being raised about the way governments are using the issue of fake news in order to silence the media.
I mean, Andy, that's a question I can put to you. You're one of the biggest publishers on the continent, and you've got businesses all over the continent with the takeover of your company as well. I mean, how have you handled that? Because one of the things that came out of this COVID chaos for us is that there were all these different different sources coming in, different information coming in. It was a really heavy job to try and sift through it. How have you tried to approach that?
Well, we've in fact followed the path we've been on for quite some time. As we've built a subscriber base in digital and print over many years. Digital, obviously, a lot less years, but it's been an amazing experience for us because you're getting this flight to quality that's happening. So our subscriber base in digital, in certain products has tripled, in other products has doubled, in others is up 25-30%, and that's since end of March, and that's because people have recognized that they need a curated experience. They really haven't. There's a level of trust which is very important that people must have in the product sets, a level of quality that these products must put out, and that curation is what people are looking for. And we've seen a really, really big growth in subscriber base as a result of that phenomenon.
So Takutsu, if I come straight to you now, how ironic is all of this at a time when the media, arguably the traditional media like us, has been more needed than ever to keep Africa informed about what's happening in COVID-19, that we're actually struggling to keep the word going out there, you know, the filtered, trusted word.
Yeah, true, because that's been the challenge that traditional media has been facing, in the sense that it performs a very critical role in terms of dissemination of, trustworthy news. The mismatch has occurred in the sense that, the real revenues that come into the print platform have obviously shifted to digital platforms, which is where all these social media platforms and where all the fake news essentially is shared around. So it's quite an unfortunate situation, scenario, in the sense that, we are now a lot more relevant, and it actually became quite clear over the last couple of months that people reverted back to the tried and tested traditional sources of news, because there's an element of trust. But the sad reality is that, the offering that we bring to the market, our relevance to the market and to society as a whole is not being reciprocated with revenues coming into the industry.
If I could ask you now, Paula, as well, from a slight distance from the mainstream media, how do you think the media is likely to adapt as we try to get out of COVID-19?
Sorry, I'm going to unmute. If you're not an agile, change-friendly organization already, it's almost too late to try and inculcate that culture within your organization. And so one of the things that I see as someone who works with smaller media entities is that very, very often in this situation, we're finding that the guys with the financial and the human resources are able to take advantage of the situation and to be able to overcome it. And my concern really is with the smaller entities out there, they don't have all of these resources, but do of course have the advantage of being a little bit more agile and a little bit more entrepreneurial in a pandemic like this.
Andy, if I could ask you, and I'll ask Takutsu as well, as like big giant, shall we say, in the publishing world here. I mean, myself, I used to buy several newspapers a day, but I probably can't remember the last time I did, just because a lot of people are changing the way that they consume news. How are you going to make that transition from being largely a print organization to being largely an online organization?
Chris, we were hoping we could do that over a bit of time, until this hit. I think that we're definitely seeing an acceleration of that transition. I mean, I think we've put in place a lot of building blocks around putting paywalls up, around creating a digital first environment for our journalists. This work from home thing's been amazing. It's just been a confirmation that we don't need to live in the traditional bricks and mortar type environments. But I mean, the big issue really becomes one of the loss of advertising that will come from the closure of potential closure of print titles, and our ability to transition with enough speed into a reader revenue type business model. Okay, so I don't think, and I really, I mean, I keep saying this to people because as soon as there's a crisis, everyone's going to have their sort of bias about, okay, well, that's the end of print then. It's not the end of print. I mean, I think that there's no question for me that the market leaders will be around for quite some time. I do think that there will be a kind of systemic decline that will occur. There's no question that's been happening over time. But we're already seeing bounce back in terms of the readership. As retail's opened up, product sales have improved. So I don't think that it's an either-or situation, but we have had to accelerate our transition.
Now, if I could come to you, Takutwa, I mean, a lot of people have been saying for years, oh, print's finished, et cetera, but I ask you in your business, a lot of people out there, they don't have good broadband, they don't have connectivity that goes with online consumption of news. How big is that market still, where people actually have to go and physically buy a newspaper to stay in touch?
So it's actually quite large on an African context. So we're still predominantly a South African-based organization, but the reality is when you look at the South African demographics, people tend to talk a lot about everyone shifting into digital platforms, but the reality is quite a big, large percentage of the South African population cannot afford to buy the mobile devices or access to the internet. And print still is a form of information for the source of information for a lot of people. And because of that, the ability or the market for people that are going to buy newspapers is still largely there. The challenge with print media, is that the cost of actually producing that newspaper and the distribution of it is so large that it actually doesn't justify the cover price in a lot of the instances. Hence, focus on advertising as being a large revenue source. We've also been investing on our side, on payment gateways, and there is a market for that in South Africa, but the challenge that we're facing on our side is that the numbers are not large enough, to justify the revenue that you need to support the infrastructure that's in the background to support the generation of those newspapers. So I think we're still a long way with print being on our shores, but what COVID has definitely done is accelerated the need for us to actually invest and accelerate the deployment of our digital strategies.
If I could just go to you, Paula, as an industry veteran, I mean, with something like more than 500,000 websites being launched every day, and someone posting 17 posts every second that we speak, how do you think the competition from online is still going to impact on the traditional print media?
Chris, I mean, it's quite interesting to listen to your fellow panelists just talk about print. And as someone who grew up in print and who always thought that she had ink in her veins until she realized that she had not actually tangibly read a newspaper in years, I think that in many ways we're looking at the acceleration of what has been a consumer-led disruption. And I think that as during this lockdown, one of the things that is happening is that new habits are being formed. And it's very unlikely that people are going to go back to the old consumption patterns when the lockdown or the pandemic is cleared up and we get used to this new normal. I think one of the challenges is not so much whether there's still life left in print, which is still a huge driver of advertising, but whether we can find the right models for monetization. And I think that's the challenge with media, particularly media that has been built around print right now, is that we need to find new ways to monetize this particular product. And I worry that if we're kind of still looking at the industry as being built around a tangible product, we might lose a whole generation of young people who are quite comfortable using Uber and Lyft and streaming off Netflix, and so paying for an intangible project online that the moment might pass us. And I think that's the challenge for media across the continent right now.
And just going back to you, Andy Gill at Arena, every single media organization on this entire continent has had to cut back its cost base. But how much leaner and meaner do you think the media can get without losing some of its depth and clout?
So yeah, I mean that's the risk, right? I mean the object is the objective is quality, and the only way you're going to survive in this market is with a quality product. And at the same time, you've got this this contraction in advertising spend that puts a lot of that under pressure. You know, a lot of our businesses have right-sized quite a lot over the last 3-4 years, especially in back office type functions. We've restructured a lot of the cost base already, and you know, we have no plans to cut back from an editorial perspective any of our costs. We're looking for efficiencies wherever we can. So we have a very large traditional bricks and mortar building here, which frankly, I don't think the 11,000 square meters that we currently have will be more than half utilized as a result of this. So there are a lot of different ways we can make savings. I think that, and I think it's a point that really needs to be made, is that if we want print products, if we want news products, which include print products, to survive, we need a level of consolidation at the back end, right? We don't need, I want the Sunday Times to compete with the City Press. I don't need to compete with the City Press in terms of our distribution or in terms of our printing. That needs to be fully commoditized for us to create sustainability for these products in the long term and ensure diversity of voice. So for me, consolidation in the industry, not at the title level, but at the back end level, is fundamental to create economies of scale, without which we will have an even more accelerated decline.
And if I could just ask you, Takutu, as well, what about the talent as well? I mean, one thing that has occurred to me in the last few weeks is that even before the lockdown, a lot of people, because of the small resources in the industry, were looking to government, they're going to PR, all kinds of other jobs, because simply it paid more. I mean, how are we going to get professional people whose job it is to tell us what's happening?
Yes, that's something that's starting to become a big challenge because to get that level of experience, it's also going to cost you quite a bit of money. And, you know, over the years, as the media houses have tried to rationalize costs, a lot of the casualties have been the more experienced, high-earning editorial people. So, and that's also resulted in effectively the juniorization of most of the newsrooms nationally. So going forward, it is a challenge, and unfortunately, you know, we're not in an economy where our government can effectively come in on a long-term basis and subsidize the cost of, you know, employing seasoned journalists, because the economy just isn't big enough for it, and we are facing our own challenges as a country. So it means that as companies, we have to look at other efficiencies. And as Andy said, you know, like at the end of the day, it's all about consolidation of your back office, you know, but not just in terms of the company. It might also mean consolidation across the industry. And that's something that, you know, the competition authorities need to start looking into, for in the context of, you know, how best can they make it easier for companies in the media industries to collaborate together in the interest of saving the industry. Because no media industry company on its own is able to stand in its own footing without any reliance on other competitor media industries sharing an infrastructure.
Sure. Well, we're going to talk a little bit more about regulation and the setup of the industry in the moment. But for now, Paula, if I could ask you, as an industry veteran as well, one thing about this online competition, a lot of people share a lot of information online, but a lot of people, they get bored, they walk away, they go do something, it's not their job. Whereas the likes of you and I, it's our job to stick with the story. It's our job to sift it and cut the wheat from the chaff. What are we going to do about the shortage of people in that position?
So one of the really interesting things, and we've seen fascinating figures in terms of the increased consumption, not only the increased consumption, but people also consuming media over longer periods of time until quite late at night. A colleague of mine in Egypt told me that she had seen phenomenal increases, over 300% of people coming to the website looking for verified information. And I think that's quite important. And that, as Andy said earlier on, that there's been a flight to quality, right? And I think that in this particular case, this is what media verified media actually has an advantage with. But when it comes to social media, when it comes to kind of the the never-ending coronavirus stroke COVID-19 story. I think that what we've also found is that there's a real place for smaller niche entities. And in South Africa, we've seen that our health news agencies, for example, Becky Cisa, Spotlight, and Healthy, have done phenomenally well in terms of being able to kind of give high quality health information to very, very different audiences. And we're beginning to see smaller media entities come up and take a little bit of the space. So there certainly seems one of the shifts that we've seen in during the pandemic is a move to more also niche content where people are looking for specific kinds of content as much as possible. But yes, social media does offer a constant threat. And I think that we should be embracing it rather than seeing it as a threat, because I do feel that what social media is showing us are new platforms to publish our stories.
And if I can go back to you, Andy Gill, you know, what can the government do, if anything, to help media? At the time, there was a lot of talk about how the government could maybe help bail out the private media like ourselves. But what do you think physically can be done?
Well, it's difficult. I mean, I think that if you look at international experience, a lot of the support has come from, yes, some form of subsidization, some form of support in terms of marketing and those kind of areas. Other areas they've done internationally is you know, putting a bit of a sharper eye on Google and Facebook. We're able to take quite a lot of the revenue away from the local publishing market. So those sort of interventions are there, but to be honest, I don't see any activity on that basis. I think that, you know, the real concrete thing that can be done right now is a recognition that if we have the ability to consolidate the kind of back end services, we would probably create a much longer runway for the product sets and allow that transition to happen a lot more smoothly.
I mean, Takutwa at the Independent Group, I mean, all through this COVID-19 lockdown, the government's been full of praise for the media. We were there broadcasting live. We were getting important messages out to the public, which arguably saved lives. Would there not be a case for the government to say, okay, well, let's give you tax breaks for 6 months or a year to try to help the media to recover?
Well, yes, I mean, tax breaks are always welcome, but I think what we probably need more from the government immediately is for them to actually start spending more on advertising. The government has quite a lot of departments that need to be engaging with the public at large, especially informing the public about how to conduct themselves, how to protect themselves during this period, you know, the new normal. So, and one of the ways to do it is to do it in partnership with traditional media. And we've got quite a lot of advertising inventory, which is waiting for the government to come and take up, you know. So in terms of immediate responses, it's the government pumping in money in the form of advertising. And it's not charity in a sense, because we're actually providing a service that the government actually needs. Tax breaks and all those things are nice and everything, but at the end of the day, you only get that benefit much later at the end of the year, and that's all assuming that you're in a profitable situation. For a lot of media houses are not in a profitable situation, so tax breaks are not necessarily going to be helpful. But what's important right now more than anything is cash, and the only way government can assist is pump cash into the market through its government departments in the form of advertising. That's something that will definitely help.
Yeah, Paula, I mean, is that an answer? There's been controversies in the past about government advertising in private media. I mean, the government still says, oh, you guys are private media, it's up to you to make money. But is that not the case for the government to support media in these difficult times in terms of helping them survive?
It's been quite interesting because the Kenyan authorities last week, so the Kenyan authorities last week actually put up a just under $1 million US fund for about 150 broadcasters. And even in South Africa, we have the MBDA that has had 2 actual calls for emergency funding for smaller entities. But you're right, you know, there are real concerns about asking the government for money, asking the government for support, because you don't also want a situation where government then feels that it can actually contribute to the message, or certainly contribute to determine what the message would be. And certainly you've seen that before across the continent, where advertising was wielded as a weapon, as a threat against media that didn't toe the line. So I think that, there are pros and cons, and I certainly would agree with Takutso that maybe we need to be looking beyond kind of government bailouts or taxes, but perhaps looking at different ways of being able to generate the income that is necessary to keep the media going.
Okay, well, the first of our questions are coming in from the audience, and here's one for you, Andy Gill, in the private media, well, which we all are. So someone asked here, does the changing landscape affect earned media? Not quite sure what it means, but this makes it clear. We find that when PR professionals send their press releases, they are sometimes met with advertising and marketing people from media houses asking for a coverage fee. Should we pay for earned media in terms of PR? What's your view on that, Andy Gill?
Well, I mean, there's a, it's only earned if the curator, i.e. the editor, believes it's worth carrying. That's the first point. There's a lot of puffery that comes through from a PR perspective quite a lot of the time. But I mean, we've created a channel, and not we as Arena, but we as the industry have created a channel for this sort of media, which is that it's native content and advertorial, and that is, as long as we're very clear about the fact that these PR drivers and that earned media is paid for content, then I think that's a very valid business model. The problem is, I'm not going to, none of us are going to say, right, give us some money and we'll write editorial that makes it look as though we're endorsing your product set. There's no, that's what a lot of these guys are looking for. No one's going to take, well, hopefully no one's going to take a PR release and just slap it on the page and hope that it looks like news.
Okay, and I'm coming to you, Takutso, at Independent Media. Someone online here just saying that they're thanking us in the media for telling them what's going on and putting our own lives at stake, which is very true, and appreciating the interesting discussion we've got here. But what's Independent Media's position with the line between advertising and editorial?
Look, the two need to coexist at the end of the day, because advertising at the end of the day funds the business. But as Andy said earlier, it's not about just promoting stories and putting things on the front page because it makes suppose someone has paid for it. But at the end of the day, display advertising is something that's on the decline. At the end of the day, it's if you're going to be taking advertorials or custom content in any form, it needs to be displayed clearly, and the reader needs to be able to understand that this is something that's actually been paid for and is not something that's gone through like your typical editorial structures. At the end of the day, if traditional advertising is shifting, we now also have to start looking at the sources of revenue, and if that comes in the form of advertorials, so be it. But it doesn't mean that we have to trick the market into thinking that it's like this puff piece is news. It needs to be spelled out clearly that this actually is like an advertorial and it's paid for content.
Well, I come to you, Paula. We were talking not so long ago about the survival of the media and how it needs to be more agile. Now, in the media landscape we have here in South Africa, there's a lot of large, powerful, long-standing monopolies, and we know pretty much who they are. Is there not a case for breaking up some of the media, unlocking some of the behemoths we've got, and to make the media more agile and more able to adapt?
Sorry, Chris, I didn't hear your question. Could you repeat it, please?
Okay, sorry, Paula. I'll just say again, there are a lot of long-standing monopolies and large organizations that dominate the media here. Is there not an argument for sort of maybe changing things with regulation, breaking them up, and making the media more agile so it can adapt and survive?
So I really do feel that agility in this stage is a kind of a business imperative. The reality is that South Africa's economies of scale is such that really, if you want, you do need a bigger media. You know, if you're in the UK or the US where you've got millions of people buying newspapers, the cost of production are much lower because of the number of people who end up consuming. But in South Africa, our audiences are actually quite small. And so to be able to produce quality media really kind of it's very costly to just you know, the story that you read in the newspaper, somebody wrote it, somebody edited, somebody produced the picture. And so really there's a huge cost to this. I think the issue of size is also an issue about the size of our audience and the actual population that is buying media. What I'd like to see, though, is increased support for our community media and increased support for smaller media entities, because I don't think that we need to be decreasing the number of media houses or the number of media products out there. I think we need to be increasing it to give people the diversity of voices, a diversity of choices. And so that would be my thing. And it's one of my concerns, actually, about the pandemic and the media, is that there's real global research that is showing that the pandemic has had a disproportionate impact of women in the workplace, and that we're seeing more women actually being retrenched or being furloughed. And my concern is that when the lockdown ends, what are we going to find in terms of leadership in newsroom floors? What are we going to find in terms of leadership, whether women in fact have been affected more than their male colleagues, and whether we will still have South Africa has a very good reputation in terms of the number of women leaders. And I really would like to see what the impact of COVID will be on the management structure of media houses in South Africa, because transformation still remains an issue.
Andy, if we just have a quick comment on that, I mean, how are you going to retool your media leadership after some of the cutbacks that we've all faced? What's your plan for the future?
So, as you know, we've just gone through a takeover in the last 6 months anyway. So we're looking at various structural changes. But there's no question for me that I think, as Paula said, we have a good history, especially in our business, of strong focus on female leadership, but it's been historically at the editorial level. So, you know, for us, we've got a sort of core management team of 3 or 4 people, and it's a question of making sure that we get that to be reflective in a much more kind of structured way than it has been in the past. But we've got a very small management team. You know, I like it that way. It does mean that it's a bit harder for us, but there's no question it's the focus.
Okay, and there's a question just come in, which I'll put back to you, Andy, and then we'll come to Takutwa. Someone saying, well, what are the panelists' thoughts on the dismantling of traditional legacy structures and restructuring media organizations to fit, from a business model perspective, the evolving landscape? In some instances, it's always felt a bit like trying to squeeze a square peg into a round hole. What do you say to that, Andy?
So there's no question that the square peg and the round hole, when it comes to traditional media, if you look back 5 years, we did a fundamental transformation of our business 5 years ago, where we had 4 or 5 separate newsrooms. We had everyone going, "What's this digital thing?" And you know, it really was it was a big shift to try and get the traditional journalists, the traditional products to focus in on digital, just as a starting point. You know, the amount of transformation we've gone through over the last 5 years for me has been fascinating, and it's been painful for some people, but it has had a really big impact in terms of that. So I think a lot of that restructuring has happened. I think what's going to happen now is that restructuring is that you're not going to really need to have all these physical structures in place in order to put a product together. You know, there's a core team clearly who's going to finish a product and stick it down to the press. But to be honest, the rest of the guys are working very well remotely, and it's changed the nature of how they work, and it's made people realize that digital first is the right answer.
So talking about print costs, sorry, Paula, I think you wanted to come in, but I'll come back to you in a second. On the back end of consolidation of print costs, how soon are the industry players going to engage each other on what that would be and what would be an ideal regulator? That's a question from the audience. Takutwa.
Well, historically, there's been a fair bit of cooperation in the media industry. We compete on the front with our products, but in the back end, there's been quite a lot of cooperation, and that cooperation has been in the areas around production and distribution mostly. And that is something that needs to continue going forward, because that's the only way of reducing your average cost per product going forward. And without that, and if any media industry wanted to go at it alone, they'll obviously face some severe challenges going forward. But in addition to that, because of the infrastructure that's already in place and the excess capacity that's available, it also means that media companies now need to look at other sources of revenue. Most of the deliveries ideally normally take place in the morning, but during the rest of the day, that distribution infrastructure does have capacity. So what are you going to do with that capacity? There's like an increase in e-commerce sales, and there's a need for fulfillment. So does it mean that maybe we can reconfigure our distribution infrastructure to assist with e-commerce deliveries, those type of things? There is a need to print packaging products and things like that. And if we have printing presses and things like that, start utilizing a lot of that to generate revenues of that existing infrastructure, instead of just relying on advertising and single copy sales.
Well, Paula, if I could just go to you. Now, you ran an international news agency on this continent, IPS. How do you think this drop in revenue is going to impact media organizations and their international coverage?
Yeah. So, we've already seen over the years that a number of global entities have begun to reduce their travel, their general coverage of places other than their own. Obviously, with the pandemic, it's almost impossible to travel to places, and really what we're looking at are people actually using local reporters as much as possible. I think one of our big challenges is in this kind of polarized geopolitical landscape, we really are getting more insular, and so we really want to encourage people actually writing stories about different places and sharing that kind of information. But without a doubt, what you're going to find is as budgets shrink, foreign coverage is one of the first things to go. On the other hand, having said that, there has been lots of really good coverage around that. And one of the things that has happened is that donor-funded journalism has become more critical than ever before. And so you're seeing a lot of development journalism that is being funded by donors, that is doing really good coverage. And what I'm seeing certainly is that increasingly you're getting a bit of a hybrid business model, where even within a commercial entity, you're having some elements of coverage like investigative journalism or specialist journalism that is actually funded through donor funding. And then you're trying to build a sustainable model even within the donor funding, to make sure that when the donor funding or when the donor loses changes their mind about what is important, that you still have some kind of a business model that allows you to continue coverage.
Andy Gill, if I could go back to you as well. The Sunday Times, one of your major titles, has made its name over the last 20, 30 years, sending people out for months on end to go and dig into stories. How much do you fear that some of this depth can be lost, because of what we've been through?
Yeah, no question. There's a great fear that we lose that depth. Not necessarily because of the economic state, but because of the seniority of journalists. And I think that's where our investment has to really double down on a consistent basis to make that work. For me, there's no question that if we don't have that depth, we won't have the product for people to subscribe to, for those youngsters who've climbed onto Netflix and a variety of other subscription services and have now learned to subscribe. They're only doing it because there's content they want, and there's only going to be content they want if we have, that level of depth and that level of investigation. And I think a lot of the really good investigative work is being done in donor, but a lot of it's also being done by our guys. If you look at Gupta Leaks, the amount of work that went into that, along with Trillion and a variety of others, was enormous. And that investment is something that we would do gladly again. and we'll find a way. We've got to find a way to fund that commercially. For me, I do understand the donor model, but as Paula says, the donor may decide to change their mind tomorrow. Hopefully the consumer isn't going to change their mind quite as quickly and quite as fast. And that's what needs to fund our journalism.
Takutwa, we come back to you. There's a thought that we are moving towards more sort of, for want of a better word, this is a question from the floor, remote journalism to reduce costs. I mean, just to simplify it for people who are watching, I mean, someone with a cell phone taking shots, sending us stuff. A journalist, a professional journalist like myself or yourself, we'd go out there, we'd check around, we'd try and put some context around the story to make sense of it. But is there not a danger in moving that way just to cut costs?
Look, it actually is now the way of the world, because one of the models that we are going to be deploying at independent media is remote working on a much larger scale. We're not entirely 100% ready for it, but during this period, we are to move in aggressively to that space, and that actually is going to be our way of doing business going forward. And hopefully, in about 12 months' time, we'll be ready to operate in that particular space. People can work from anywhere, and it's a technology platform that you've got in-house that will enable you to be able to allow your journalists to work remotely. So over the years, we actually have been investing in products that actually allow journalists to actually capture and upload straight into our content management systems. And in the background there, the people that are curating the paper are able to view it without actually dealing with the teams physically. But at the end of the day, there's always that need for physical contact and physical engagement with your people. Journalists still need to go out and get the story. So even though it's remote working, by and large, the bulk of the work that most editorial people did was always outside. So think of your photographers. They are the ones at the forefront of most of the challenges that are taking place, because they actually have to get that image, that actually tells the story of what's actually going on the ground. And so whether they do it remotely or in the office, it doesn't really change much. What's going to make it easier is the tools that you actually afford them or make available to them so that they're able to work remotely. But that definitely is going to be the new normal in terms of how a lot of corporates and newsrooms are run going forward.
Sure, and the technology has given a lot of power to journalists. But Paula, certainly you must share some of the same concerns as I. All right, then maybe if it's a fire, it's a fire. You can take pictures of it and be pretty sure that's the story. But how many things have you seen in the last few years that looked to be something, and then when the story came out behind it, it turns out to be something completely different or completely the opposite? Well, what are your concerns about the future of truth in these circumstances? Okay, sorry, I'm just saying, Paul, I'll repeat that question. Sorry, I don't think you heard me, but I'm saying, with this remote journalism, sometimes if someone films a fire is a fire is a fire. But in terms of other stories, how many have you seen online where a story looks one way and it turns out to be completely the opposite when you find out the real story on the ground? How much do you fear for truth in this world that we live in?
I'll take that question because I feel quite passionate about it. I mean, one of the things that journalists can do is the process of verification. And so when we look at, there are a lot of things that we can get off social media, and there are a lot of ways that journalists can get information off social media. But what we're really expecting from journalists, and the reason why we come back to verified media, is the process of verification. So the ability to be able to, yes, the story was trending on social media, but is it true or not? That whole issue of, I agree with Takutwa and with Andrew, that one of the changes that we're definitely going to see is whether we actually need physical spaces for people to work together. And as someone who ran a virtual newsroom across the African continent with IPS, I mean, there are lots of advantages around that. But of course, you do lose the brainstorming, the interaction, the questioning, the pushback, the challenging around stories. And so I do feel, but we also miss that face-to-face interaction where we can do those things. We can question the veracity of stories. We can make sure that people are okay when they're out there, they're doing their stories, etc. So I think that there are pros and cons for the virtual space, but I do think that this horse has bolted, right? I mean, it's too late now to close the stable gate, because I think people are used to working from home, and so we need to find best practice for that. In terms of journalists going out there and working on their own and working remotely, we've always had correspondents, and we've always had people who haven't necessarily come into the office, and we've always been able to verify their work. So I don't think that we have any additional challenges with that. But there was an interesting question raised by one of the one of the participants in the webinar section, where they're basically asking, whether we think the nature of journalism needs to be taught differently for future journalists. And I think this is a seismic shift in the way we tell our stories, but there's no shift in the basics of journalism, the ethical principles of journalism, the collection, the curation of content. All of that remains the same. We verify, we're accurate, we're fair, we minimize harm, and we try to tell the truth as fully as possible.
Andy, we've got a question here from the audience just for you. So someone asks, how long do you think it'll take for the bulk of mainstream media to move from digital first to digital only understanding? And there will always be a small audience for print and also niche publications. What's your answer to that?
Yeah, I think that how long is a piece of string, starting with? But I think the point is that we've got definitely the transition from digital first to digital only is something that will occur for many products in the world, and as well as South Africa. How long before we have digital only for? If I look at our product sets, I'd say it's quite some time, because if I look at some of the times as a market leader, if I look at Business Day, that product has got it's really sitting in a very strong niche. The niche players, without doubt, will always have a strong print audience in some form. And as you found internationally, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, all of these guys still have a sizable chunk of their income coming from print-based product. But the more generalist products and the ones without a strong identity are the ones who are going to go first from digital first to digital only to not anywhere.
And if I could just ask you, Takutwa, at Independent Media, there's an explosion, not just online, there's an explosion of consumable media, from everything from Showmax to Netflix to whatever you like, to online news services, the whole thing. How likely is it, do you think, that traditional media like yourselves, who are just carrying on trying to stick to their knitting, could be drowned out in the future?
It's not going to be almost overnight, because at the end of the day, those other platforms, yes, they do take eyeballs away from traditional media, but at the end of the day, people still need information about what's going on ahead of them, around them. So Netflix and all of those things, yes, in terms of entertainment value, we definitely kind of compete with them. But at the end of the day, people just need to know, like, what's their local government doing? What's the Department of Education planning on about, kids returning to school? What's the Department of Health doing about the increase in COVID cases and things like that? And so that's an area where all these new technology platforms are not able to come and close the gap almost immediately. I can't talk about the future, because maybe someone else is going to come up with like a fancy digital platform that's able to do what we're doing. But for now, based on everything else that we're seeing around the world, traditional media still plays a very important role in terms of providing relevant information to the consumers and the communities at large.
But also, Takutwa, many journalists say if we knew the future, we'd all be out of a job. But anyway, if I go back to you, Paula, and you mentioned the hybrid model a bit earlier. Do you think, there's a question here from the floor, do you think in part that could also include citizen journalism?
I mean, absolutely. I think so. So if I think of what's the future of media after COVID-19, I really think that we need to be looking at the current behavioral changes that we're going through. Because if you look at how people are changing the way they live, we can look at how people are going to be changing the way they consume media. And certainly for me, the landscape includes a lot more user-generated content that is being curated and being verified and then shared on different platforms. I see people consuming stories, the same stories on multiple platforms. And so I also want to challenge, the use of the term traditional media, because what is traditional media? I've been in journalism since 1986. And so what's traditional has changed in those 3 decades, right? And even now, when you look at what's going to be traditional next year, will be the things that we kind of think of as being new age right now. So I do see that increasingly media needs to be able to be looking at new ways of telling stories, but also different people being given a platform to tell those stories.
Okay, we're just coming to our last questions now. I go to you now, Andy Gill at Arena. What gives you hope in here, in where we are in 2020, that we're going to get enough people to pay the piper in journalism?
I think what gives us hope is the international models that we've seen, working. What gives me hope is that we've seen literally significant growth in consumption of our products, both from a free perspective and a paid perspective over the last 3 months at a level we never would have expected, and not that we expected COVID either. But so I think there's a lot of hope. I really do, and I think but all of that hope is going to be pinned on one thing, and that hope is going to be, well, maybe I'm being a bit extreme, but there are 2 things. One is the hope is going to be pinned on the base that your business is sufficiently diverse and sustainable across a variety of platforms. Okay, starting with that. The only way you're going to have that is if you have quality and credibility. If you don't have those 2, I don't think there is much hope.
Takudzwa at the Independent Group. I just get a last comment from you. What gives you hope that it's not the end of print, as a lot of people are predicting?
I'll say that, the response of our employees when this challenge came onto the South African shores has been overwhelmingly positive. And, that level of dedication, the resilience that the teams have actually demonstrated during this period actually gives me hope that, if we just continue focusing on what we're good at, which is producing very good quality and trustworthy news, we'll be able to survive. But, as Andrew says, you need to diversify our revenue bases. And that's an area that we've actually been working on aggressively, not just recently, but it's something that's obviously been in the pipeline for the last couple of years. So we just need to continue focusing on all those various initiatives that we've been working on. But at the end of the day, people are the most important thing in a media house. Those papers don't produce themselves, it's people today. And as long as they're still committed and motivated enough to come and produce the products and to represent us to the outside world as being like a source of trustworthy news, then I'm sure that there's definitely hope for us as a media house going forward into the future.
Well, thank you very much indeed to my excellent panel. Paula Fray, the founder and CEO at Fray Intermedia, Andy Gill, the managing director of Arena Holdings, and Takudzwa Howe, the chief operating officer at Independent Media. And as I say, this is the first part of the media discussion. We're having the second part on Monday the 15th, on the eve of Youth Day. Let's have a quick look at what's coming up. Next week, in a special edition of Business Tomorrow on the eve of Youth Day in South Africa, we'll be telling the other side of the media story. We'll be looking further into the future of media online and social media. How much more can it change the world, and what opportunities will there be for young entrepreneurs? That's June the 15th at 1400 CAT here on CNBC Africa. I'll see you there, but for now, from this edition of Business Tomorrow, and me, Chris Bishop, and the team here, it's goodbye.